Hello and welcome back to the Toffee Blues YouTube channel, your source for all things Everton. My name is Thomas, back on the channel today with the Esk to discuss a couple of takeover rumours that really emerged towards the end of September. Not much has been kind of added to it since then, but we will talk about them, who's involved, and maybe a couple of the other potential takeovers, potential interest in the club. And as I mentioned, I'm joined by the Esk once again. Paul, first things first, how are you and how are you enjoying this this break from domestic football?
Hi Thomas. Yeah, it's great. I was counting up yesterday. I think it's 33 days until we play football again, or at least until we play Wolves in the Premier League. So it's quite sad, isn't it, that we're almost every Evertonian you speak to is like sort of really chilled out and sort of, hey, it's great we're not playing football.
Yeah, it's not. I didn't think we'd be here at the start of the season, but it seems like 7-1 away to Bournemouth on aggregate over a week. I think that does that to you. But we don't have to sit and talk about that for too long, dwell on that for too long. Because obviously we are here to talk about takeover rumours and potentially what's going on now. We know that in the summer there was a fairly strongly linked consortium linked to buying the club. There was a period of exclusivity that expired. Nothing quite materialised since then, and Mashiri posted a statement saying, look, I fully back the club, etc., etc. The general waffle that we've seen him produce before, but we'll kind of just start there, Paul. To my understanding, that all really kind of fell apart under Peter Kenyon, and we probably won't be hearing from that again.
It seems like certainly Peter Kenyon's involvement is no longer, I think it's no longer the case. I think Kaminsky is still interested, possibly with a view to taking a stake in the stadium or funding the stadium and taking a stake in the club, which is probably a more accurate way of doing it. But I know a couple of people in New York. Obviously, Kaminsky's not from New York, but I know a couple of people in New York, bankers, and they all seem to think that he doesn't have the funding to do it himself, that if he was to do it, he'd have to have funding from elsewhere. He claims he's got lots of assets, particularly in Eastern Europe, in Poland, which would allow him to put the funding up. But I could only imagine if that was the case, it would be to take a stake, as I say, to part fund the stadium, because the amount of money that a new investor coming in, if they are going to take over the whole of the club, is quite significant. Mashiri wants something like £460 million for the club. I don't think the club's worth anything like that. The club's got a load of external debt that would need to be paid off, probably £150 million, and then it's got fined £300 million probably to complete the stadium. So that means an investor coming in has got to find the best part of £900 million. Seems very, very unlikely that Kaminsky would be the person or the institution behind him that could do that. Of course, the other people that are thought to be involved in a separate bid are relatives of George Soros, so the Soros family. Now, the Soros family certainly have the money to do that. Even finding £1 billion to invest in Everton wouldn't necessarily be an issue for them, but it's gone very quiet again with them. Although it's interesting, here we are on a Friday talking about takeovers, and there are one or two rumours that are starting to develop that a deal with an American institution or consortium is close. Now, whether that's one of the two that we've just mentioned or not, I don't know, but there is, there's a little bit of chatter on social media, a little bit of chatter amongst people, financial journalists, that maybe there is a deal that's getting closer. One of the big issues I think we've got is nobody is really sure what Mashiri's intentions are. As you correctly said earlier, Thomas, he's made comments about, well, certainly at the beginning of the summer, it was clear that he was serious about trying to sell. And subsequently, he's sort of come back from that and said that, he's still got a long-term interest in Everton, albeit he'd be happy to sell a stake if an investor was prepared to take a minority position. So I think the situation is fairly fluid. I'm also aware there are people in the Middle East who've expressed an interest in the club. They're not Saudis, they're not Qataris, but they have expressed an interest. But how near that is, or how far that is, frankly, nobody knows.
Yeah, plenty to dissect there, and we'll start off with Kaminsky then, because he was obviously part of this consortium that was kind of seemed to be in the lead to buy the club over the summer before that fell apart. As you've said there, it looks like, well, the rumours are that he doesn't have the funding himself to potentially invest fully in the club, but what's been rumoured is that someone's going to buy a stake in the club and provide the funding for the stadium. And I just want to focus on that because that seems like a much more realistic possibility. We know that Mashiri is asking for a lot of money. The club does have debt, and we're not a particularly valuable proposition in terms of the whole footballing pyramid at the moment. I know there's a lot of interest in buying football clubs, especially from corporate America, and we will get onto that. But do you see that as maybe the most likely outcome before the end of the season? Let's say that there will be an investor who will come in, get a stake in the club, and also provide the funding for the rest of the stadium, because that does seem like a priority at the moment.
Yeah, it's difficult to believe that Mashiri himself wants to fully fund the stadium by himself. So, what are his options? Well, he's been trying to borrow money from banks and other institutions for the last 3 years, and the lending environment today is worse than it's been at any point in the last 3 years. So, the chances of him doing that and being able to do it at a price that is acceptable and makes sense is fairly slight. So what are his other options? Well, basically 3 other options. He can fund it himself, he can sell the whole club and then somebody else has to take on board that responsibility, or he can sell a minority stake, say 25% of Everton Football Club, to fund the stadium. But again, if he does that, that puts a very high valuation on Everton Football Club, which is not justified by the fundamentals of the club. We're losing money. We don't have a strong balance sheet. We're in debt. We don't have a huge number of player assets that we could dispose of if we had to do so. So it's difficult to see how somebody can put, say, £300 million into the club and only have a minority interest in the club, because clearly Mashiri, if he was to take on board another investor, wouldn't want to be the minority investor himself. He would want to, I imagine, retain control. So that means that he has to have more than 51% of the club. And again, even if he sold 49% for 300 million, that values the club at 600 million. The club is worth nothing like 600 million. So why would an investor do that?
Yeah, it does seem like a particularly interesting position now. We know the state of the economy as well, and we know kind of just how much money is coming in from corporate America. We've discussed this before about, interest, especially American interest in buying football clubs at the moment. But we may as well just go on to it just for a second, just before we move on to the potential other buyers in the club, because that rumor about Kaminsky came from Guardian Sport, as I mentioned, just over a month ago. Well, 2 months ago now. Sorry, I didn't realize we're in November. It seems like nothing has really materialized since then. But before we get on to the potential interest from, as you mentioned, Jeffrey Soros, why are so many Americans currently interested in buying Premier League football clubs, and why does there seem to be such a trend at the moment of buying and selling? We know, looking at Manchester United and Liverpool, that there's a lot of buying and selling of football clubs going on at the moment.
Well, I think, first of all, when there's economic unrest, that often makes investors sort of reevaluate their portfolios. So in the case of FSG with Liverpool, in the case of the Glazers at Manchester United, they bought early enough in this sort of Premier League boom time to generate big profits for themselves now if they were to sell. And of course, the valuation that Chelsea achieved, albeit Chelsea might be a different case to Manchester United or Liverpool, makes those early investors start to think about, well, actually, now might not be a bad time to take a profit. And both FSG and the Glazers would walk away with significant profits if they were to sell their clubs now. Why would other investors come in at this stage? Well, there's a belief that the Premier League represents good value. So if you're wanting to buy, if you're an American, for example, and wanting to buy a sports franchise, if you compare the values of of Premier League clubs with any of the big franchises in the US, then most football clubs look quite cheap, even Liverpool and Manchester United. And there's the view that whilst perhaps domestically the amount of money that football clubs can generate through broadcasting deals has probably plateaued and is in fact probably falling slightly, that there's still an awful lot of international money available to sell, or for the Premier League to sell the international rights to. So the idea that we're at the peak of revenues for the Premier League is probably not quite true. I think most people, or most American investors at least, see that there's quite a way to go yet. So there's still some, as far as they're concerned, there's still some upside on investing at this moment in time. So yeah, and just despite all the economic difficulties around the world, there's a huge amount of capital looking for a home in corporate America. So it's no surprise at all that there are people who can easily fund these what would be quite significant investments. Whether Everton falls into that category or not, I think depends upon what view they take as to how successful Everton can be in the future. There's a thought at the moment that because of the potential threat of relegation, that will impact the price of Everton, i.e. reduce the price. If you cleared the threat of relegation, and if you got us back to competing, say, in the top 8, then that would provide a significant uplift in valuations. Obviously, Bramley Moore coming along as well. I was doing some sort of back of the envelope figures yesterday, actually. And whilst Goodison, if we sell out every seat at Goodison next year, we'll probably generate about £18 million worth of revenue. If we sell out all of our seats at Bramley Moore, based on fairly conservative views as to what the pricing will be, the revenues from Bramley Moore in a year will probably be slightly over £50 million. So you can see there's quite a big uplift from 18 to 50 million just by going to Bramley Moore. And that's before you look at naming rights, and that's before you look at new sponsorship deals, etc. So investors looking at it would think that there is the potential to grow the value of Everton as a business. And that may be the reason why Fahad Moshiri doesn't want to sell the whole stake, because he sees that maybe in 5 years, maybe in 10 years' time, Everton will be much more valuable than it is today.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that point about club valuations there. And I know you've spoken about it before, in that looking from our perspective, especially in England, and we look at the prices of football clubs, especially when Chelsea sold, it seems like such inflated prices, and they will be, we know that. But just to kind of embellish on that point that you made about how these American investors are used to investing in these franchises in the US, which are worth way more. Their valuations are much higher. So just to kind of confirm that this is what you're saying, is that even though the prices of Premier League football clubs seem high, we know that Moshiri is clearly looking for a considerable amount more than the club's probably worth. Even with all those kind of inflated figures, it's still an attractive prospect to the American investments, considering the impact that they've seen that sports franchises can have for way higher costs.
If you believe Everton aren't going to get relegated, yeah. If Everton stayed in,
I didn't think we'd be saying that again after last season, but
no, but I mean, I don't mean that from. Well, I mean it because there is a risk, and the idea that we escaped on the penultimate game last season, and then therefore there's no risk thereafter, until Lampard establishes himself as a Premier League manager, and that's not knocking him. It's just saying until he establishes himself as a Premier League manager, until there's evidence that the players that we're recruiting, the players that are coming through from the academy, and I think that we're beginning to see some signs that the players coming through from the academy might be of the caliber that are required. But until there's real hard evidence of that and the threat of relegation disappears, there's always going to be a concern as to what Everton's future value is going to be. But if that threat disappears in the same way as I say, there's no threat of relegation at all for the top 6 clubs in England. And that's why their valuations are so high, because Premier League revenues, and in the case of most of the top 6 European revenues, are guaranteed, probably for the next 15 or 20 years. So yeah, the valuation of a business is a reflection on what the future cash flows of the business is. And those, the top 6 clubs pretty much have those revenues secured. We don't. We always did have, or we always thought we did have, but it's only in recent years, or the last 2 years, where there's been the potential for relegation. So that is obviously a factor for investors to think about, and it will reflect the current value of Everton. But the flip side is, if you remove the risk of relegation, so you become a top 8 side, say for example, then as an investor, if you invested now, you get the benefit of that in terms of the value of the club.
Okay, yeah, that does make sense. And kind of going forwards onto the more specific rumours, we mentioned Kaminsky there. That rumour came from Guardian Sport just towards the end of September. But as we started October, there was an article by Bloomberg talking about LAMF Global Ventures that are apparently holding preliminary talks with the club about buying them, advised by former Everton director Keith Harris. So just to start us off, what do you know about LAMF? That's a bit of a mouthful to say. What kind of, well, basically, what do you know about them and their interest in the club?
I think they're quite serious sports investors. I mean, they bid for Tottenham, don't forget, and they bid £3 billion for Tottenham, which is quite an inflated price, I think. As I said earlier, access to capital is not an issue. And it does appear that they're interested in the sector per se. So, yeah, I would say that they would be serious investors. I think, if you want to tick boxes, they'd probably tick more boxes than Kaminsky does. So, if Bill Kenwright or Fahd Nashiri got a telephone call from Jeffrey Soros, then he would take it serious, without a shadow. He would take it seriously without a shadow of a doubt.
Yeah, okay, and we know that Keith Harris is advising them, former Everton director. I don't know if you've got any words on that about his time at Everton, and now seeing that, is that a potential positive link, that there is a link to the club there? But just your opinion on that.
Keith has been linked with so many different deals over the years, some of which he claims he was a significant part of. But then if you talk to the actual parties themselves, they reduce the amount of involvement or the amount of influence that he had. No doubt he's of some use to Americans who are looking, as a first port of call. You might want to speak to somebody like Keith Harris, who's obviously got contacts. He has some knowledge of Everton, having been deputy chairman for a couple of years. But I would discount Keith Harris's value beyond an initial approach, beyond an initial sort of, perhaps he makes the introductions. Beyond that, I don't think he has much effectiveness.
Yeah, and these rumours, as I mentioned, developed from Bloomberg. I think they were also backed up by Paul Joyce, a man who's trusted fairly well in Everton circles for Everton news. And it does seem like this was a realistic possibility. This kind of emerged about almost 2 months ago now, as I mentioned. And I know you've said they've definitely got the capital about it. But now these kind of investors are coming in, because I remember there being a bit of doubt at the time about the Peter Kenyon consortium. I don't know how many Peter Kenyon consortiums we've kind of seen go to rubbish over the past few years, but this is a completely kind of different prospect and definitely have the financial backing. So is this kind of a good sign, would you say, going forwards, that if these serious investors are looking at Everton Football Club, maybe that we know the threat of relegation is going to potentially negate the value or dissuade investors from looking at the club and maybe look elsewhere in the Premier League? But with such a serious bidder seemingly very interested in the club, we can only take that as a positive sign, surely.
Yeah, I think if Fahd Nashiri is serious about selling the club, he will find serious investors, or serious potential investors. the question with Fahad Mashiri is whether he's serious about what he says or what his people say he's doing. I think he has to be serious because of the reasons I gave earlier. I don't think he has the cash to do it himself, or he has the desire to do it himself, and he's not certainly not going to find it easy to borrow the money, as we know. So he must, if he's got any doubt at all about his ability to fund the rest of the stadium, he must be serious when he's talking to these people. But such is Mashiri's reputation within football at this moment in time, until you actually see it for yourself, I think it's a slightly dangerous game to say, yes, he must be serious because of the circumstances I've just explained.
It does seem like well, we know he's a very difficult man to predict at the best of times, but this seeming interest that we've seen kind of progress over time does maybe, suggest towards the club being sold in the future, or at least a stake. And something I do want to touch on, of course, kind of aside from the financial aspect, is that when someone does take over a club, obviously their background is looked into. We've known that for Newcastle and the Saudi Arabian takeover. Without going into too many details, we know that the Soros family maybe don't have too many ideal types. But what do you think of that at the moment? Have we got to a point where the only investors who could potentially buy Premier League football clubs, you are going to get, I don't know how to put this nicely, dislikable characters potentially owning football clubs because of the nature of the money that owners will be asking for?
Sadly, yes, because football itself, you start at FIFA, you look at UEFA, you look at the Premier League. They're not prepared to make the changes to the game, to the governance of the game, that would keep away the more dodgy characters. Let's put it that way. Or indeed the states that want to use football for sports washing. I think you've got two choices as somebody who's running football. It's either open doors and you don't care who owns your clubs within the game, or you have a very tightly regulated game that says we will only allow people of a certain standing, or we'll only allow institutions of a certain standing to be in the game, which obviously narrows down the number of people that can invest in football. But in the long term, is that the better strategy? Personally, I believe it is, because it gets rid of the people who are not as desirable as others, and it gets rid of the idea that you might allow states to invest in football in order to enhance their reputation. Such as, for example, Saudi Arabia. Such as, for example, if Qatar came in and bought a Premier League club, they would only be doing so from the perspective of this assists them in their sort of, in their objectives as being seen as global players, as being seen as, something that's a bit warmer, a bit friendlier, a bit cooler than actually reality is in terms of what those states are. I would take a hard line if I was involved in running football, but just as evidenced by, and I'm not going to talk about it, but just as evidenced by, where the World Cup is currently, that's not an issue. That doesn't seem to be an issue for the people that run the game.
Yeah, it does seem to be a very tricky thing, especially for fans to consider, because obviously we have no say in who buys the club and who doesn't. But it does seem that every investor who does come along are going to have less than desirable characteristics, or the past that they have, and it's something I've definitely debated on for a long time, because as you mentioned there, if you were in charge of running football, there would be a much tighter ship in how and who can buy football clubs, and especially if countries can buy football clubs. But it is just a very realistic possibility. Well, not very realistic. It is the actuality that we do live in now, that any investor potentially coming into the club, because of the amount of money that is demanded, it is going to have this issue. But I don't think there's too much to discuss there, because without anyone actually significantly, without any significant progress clearly being made in buying the club, and these rumours popping up maybe every month or so, it's hard to say. But I do think it's an interesting debate to have, and one that I'm sure we'll have further down the line, especially if this kind of interest does materialise any further about the nature of ownership in the football club.
Yeah, I mean, why should fans say that have got certain a certain moral stance or certain standards that they apply to their own lives. Why? Because a football club can be sold to somebody that doesn't have the same standards. Why should any individual, say somebody like somebody like me who's got 4 or 5 generations of Everton supporters behind me, why should I have to make the choice between either continuing to support my football club or to reduce the standards by which, say, I operate, in the rest of my life? And I think that's a massive issue. I often feel very sorry for some Newcastle United supporters. Many Newcastle United supporters will not be that concerned that Saudi Arabia or a Saudi-related organisation owns their football club, but there will be some people that are. And why is it that football can be taken away from those people just on the basis that we can sell to whomever we want?
Yeah, the situation that football is in at the moment, because it doesn't seem to be getting any better, does it? It seems like we know that when Manchester City were bought, that was sports washing. When it not less common, but seemingly less common, and since then we've seen the likes of Saudi Arabia invest in by Newcastle, and is it Qatar who own PSG? I can't quite remember
Yeah,
that. But that is the sad state of football as it is. But as I mentioned, maybe a debate we can really embellish further down the line if we have any more concrete rumours about
sure.
who's buying the club. But kind of just to conclude then, because there was a rumour a couple of days ago from a less reliable source than your Guardian, your Bloomberg, and your Paul Joyce that there is seemingly an unnamed US consortium very interested. We've heard of this before. So kind of just concluding thoughts there from yourself on, I mean, what is the rest of the season or potential couple of seasons look like? Because we know we need investment in the club in order to fund the stadium, which hasn't materialised yet. So it seems like we are kind of reaching a boiling point and that we are going to have to find this funding. But how much is Mashiri going to want to give up in order to achieve that?
I think we probably have a more immediate need in terms of what we can do in January and whether we need new investors before we can do anything in January, even if profitability and sustainability allows us to do so. But let's assume for a second we get over that hurdle and we can do that. Then between now and the end of the financial year, which is June next year, June 2023, we have to find a solution to how we continue to fund the stadium beyond that time. The club have said that the report and accounts say that the stadium is funded up to the end of this financial year. We need to know well before the end of the financial year how we're going to fund, the last year before hopefully the stadium is completed in 24-25. So the issue is only going to get bigger and bigger as time goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like not fairly, it's a very concerning prospect going forwards that we do lack the funding that the stadium's going to need. And well, hopefully it will materialise going further. But I think that's kind of just about all we have time for today. I'm not sure if you've got any thoughts you'd like to conclude with.
No, I mean, one of the things is we don't know. I mean, it might be that Mashiri can fund everything. And then that gets onto the argument about, well, why don't the club disclose more? Why don't the club engage more with the fan base? And why don't the club take away some of these concerns, some of these worries that supporters naturally have? They could do that very easily by communicating more effectively. And if anybody from the club's listening, as I'm sure they are, that would be my message to them. The club, Fayed Mashiri, has to communicate more with the fans.
Absolutely, yeah. I hope he's watching this video and he's listening. But as I mentioned, that's pretty much all we have time for today, Paul. As always, thank you very much. If anyone wants to find out more about your work and the articles that you write, where can they find you?
The ESC on Twitter or the ESC.org on the internet.
Thank you very much. And thank you all very much for watching. Be sure to join us next time on the Toffee Blues. As you know, we bring these videos every now and then when, there are significant rumours potentially about the finances behind the club or any kind of takeover rumours materialising. But so stay tuned for them. Check out Twitter, check out all our social medias. And of course, as I mentioned, check out Paul. Writes fantastic articles where we can go into more depth than we have time for in these videos. And you can learn a lot more about the goings on behind the scenes at the club. So thank you all very much for watching and join us next time on the Toffee Blues. Goodbye.